Today we're tackling something that I've spent hundreds of hours researching, but almost nobody ever explains properly. The XRP supply shock theory. And you've heard it 1,000 times. When the banks start using XRP, all of the supply of XRP is going to disappear. That's going to have a massive impact on the price. But most people have no idea where this theory comes from. What do the documents actually say? Are the mechanics behind this whole thing even real in the first place? So I'll cut straight to the chase, and I will tell you now that the XRP supply shock theory is one of the only XRP theories that stands on real institutional logic. But you should never just take my word for it, or anyone's for that matter. You need to see the receipts. So in this video, I'm going to show you the exact sources and the research and the papers so you can verify it all for yourself. And right after you click subscribe, let's begin. So we know that the world is moving towards this instant settlement system, meaning whenever a payment needs to take place, it can happen instantaneously. The problem is with the system that we currently operate in and the system that has operated for quite some time, these payments aren't instant. Sometimes it'll happen 2 days later, a week later, and the rulebooks for banking across the world have been very clear in this environment. And that is, you must pre-fund accounts to make these settlements. That's not an opinion of mine, that's straight out of the IMF and Bank of International Settlement documentation. These guys are the architects of the banking system. What they say goes. In 2024, the IMF published a paper, and the title of this paper was Financial Platforms for the G20. On page 13, the IMF writes this: immediate settlement entails liquidity costs because transactions must be pre-funded. And this one paragraph establishes the first pillar of XRP supply shock theory. Pre-funding these accounts is not a crypto theory. Pre-funding accounts is actually a requirement. And if a system requires this pre-funding, that means it also requires what's called locked liquidity. And in layman's terms, it means you need to actually have a pool of cash, a pool of assets, whatever that asset is, in that account waiting for these transactions. In the crypto world, that's really important because if you take cryptocurrency out of circulation, well, there's less crypto in circulation. If the demand keeps increasing for that asset and the supply is going down, the price will go up. This is the first pillar of XRP supply shock theory. In 2023, the IMF also released another document on this topic, and it was called Trust Bridges and Money Flows. And if we go to box 2 in this document, the IMF illustrates using a CBDC into the Cambodian real currency, and within that corridor, specifically using an automated market maker. As we move on in this video, I'll just refer to that as an AMM. And they explain that liquidity providers in these payment corridors must supply both assets into that pool. So the idea is that Cambodia will contribute Cambodian real and the stablecoin or CBDC, in this case it was USDC, and whoever's providing the USDC must also provide the Cambodian real. And so the pool has to hold both of the assets in advance of the transactions, meaning they have to lock the assets in the pool ahead of time. And within there's typically always a smart contract that's automatically setting the rate, the FX rate between the two. So the IMF here is explicitly saying that in an AMM environment, you have to lock up liquidity, you have to pre-fund these accounts. And this is exactly the architecture that the Bank of International Settlements also tested with Project Mariana. Project Mariana happened in 2023, and it was a trio partnership between the Swiss National Bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the Bank of France. And in this report, the Bank of International Settlements describes a design where liquidity providers deposit wholesale CBDCs into an automated market maker, an AMM. Those CBDCs then remain locked inside the pool, and the liquidity providers receive LP tokens that represent their share of the pool. Again, the BIS is explicitly testing AMMs and CBDC AMM pools. And again, that the model only works when you're pre-funding these accounts, which means the whole pre-funded, immobilized liquidity is not some random conspiracy. This is the actual architecture that the central banks work under. But if we go back to the IMF's Trust Bridges paper, on page 10, the IMF categorizes 3 settlement asset models: public chains with stablecoins, open source platforms like Stellar, and private settlements such as Ripple XRP. I want you to pay attention to this line: a private settlement asset and marketplace such as Ripple's XRP. The IMF almost never mentions specific cryptocurrencies, but here they do. and they place XRP squarely in this private settlement asset space. And this is the same category that aligns perfectly with liquidity pools and AMM architecture. And that means if XRP is used in these liquidity pools, these AMMs, everything we just saw, the pre-funding, the freezing of those assets, the immobilization of them, the locking those tokens out of the circulating supply, directly applies here. But there's one more key piece to understanding that we need. In October 2023, the FSB, which is the Financial Stability Board, they published financial stability implications of tokenization. And on page 13, they said, atomic settlement may increase liquidity demands where no liquidity saving mechanism exists. They go on to expand that tokenized markets reduce counterparty risk, but increase liquidity requirements. So the global regulators are all saying the exact same thing. The more instant the settlement, the more liquidity is required. So that means pre-funded liquidity that's frozen, locked away from the general circulating supply, creating a supply shock. And now we're building that mechanical foundation of this theory, because people love to say that XRP must become the infrastructure. But what does infrastructure mean in regulator language, the people who actually make the decisions? And there is an answer. The answer is in the Bank of International Settlements PFMI document. Annex F relates to critical service providers, which we determined in previous episodes that XRP must be deemed as a critical service provider in order to be accepted into this system. And the Bank of France summarizes it here. Annex F defines oversight expectations for critical service providers. SWIFT is the main example. And this is the key. SWIFT isn't money. It's not a currency, it's not a bank asset, it's not a security, it's really just infrastructure. And this is why a supply shock is even possible in the first place, because infrastructure assets don't circulate, they don't move around. They actually sit inside the machine permanently. I want you to think about what that means for XRP. The XRPL documentation clearly states that there are only 100 billion tokens ever created on the XRPL, and all of that XRP was created at the inception of the XRPL. And there are other factors at play here as well. Ripple actually has an escrow account of about 55 billion of those 100 billion tokens. That's 55% of the supply that's already out. Additionally, there is a burn rate attached to the transactions on the XRPL. That means every transaction that takes place on the XRPL takes a tiny fraction of an XRP out every single time, deleted it forever. And so what we have is a decreasing float. That's what we call it, an ever decreasing amount of tokens in circulation. Now, I don't think the burn rate plays that big of a factor, but it is a factor, especially if we have high velocity payments taking place. And potentially, as it relates to this supply shock thing, lots of additional XRP being taken out of circulation to be locked away, frozen in these pre-funded accounts just to allow an AMM-based world to exist. None of this is really theory either. This is taken from Bank of International Settlement documents and IMF documents as well. And so just as an example, if a CBDC corridor, a payment between two locations using CBDCs, let's say they need 30 million XRP locked away to function. And let's say the global system uses thousands of these different corridors. Well, the XRP in all of those different pools that are pre-funded for those corridors is completely locked away and only being used for those specific transactions between those payment corridors, effectively completely out of circulation, reducing the amount of XRP that's in the circulating supply. While the demand for XRP increases, the price of any given XRP would naturally increase. This is pretty basic supply and demand dynamics. And so if XRP is selected as this neutral bridge asset, and it's used in the way that the Bank of International Settlements and the IMF explain in their models and how they explain in the documents how this all actually works, then a significant percentage of XRP would be taken out of circulation just to sit in these pre-funded accounts, reducing the circulating supply and creating an upward pressure on the price of an XRP token. There's nothing magical happening here. This is just, locked up liquidity based on the rules, acknowledging that XRP has this infrastructure role. And so the supply shock theory is almost essentially built into XRP. If XRP isn't chosen as this neutral bridge asset, there will be no supply shock. They go hand in hand. So what I found is that most of these theories regarding XRP almost always collapse when you start looking at the institutional documentation. But the supply shock theory for XRP stands on BIS documentation, IMF documentation. The the FSB's liquidity analysis, the fact that the XRP has a limited supply, and that there is such a thing in Annex F as the category of critical service providers, which XRP fits perfectly. And this is the only XRP theory that matches how the banks actually operate, how settlement systems are actually being designed, and how liquidity is being treated from an institutional infrastructure perspective. Lots of big words there, sorry. But as I was going through all of this documentation, I was feeling like there was something more here, that there needs to be something more. I'm missing something. There's a gap in my understanding here. And I came to realize that when it comes to the bigger question for me, which is, okay, so how much XRP would be needed? How much liquidity does the financial system need in these pools? Because if we can deduce that number, then we can start to actually accurately model out the price of an XRP better than anyone has ever before. We will actually be able to gauge the price of an XRP based on utility, which has been extremely speculative up until this point. So I went on a search. What is this exact number? Do the banks have these formulas and calculations to determine how much liquidity is needed in an AMM system? Because if you want instant settlements and you want AMMs to do it, which is where the world is moving, by the way, you need a formula, you need a process, you need that to be very well understood, to be accepted. Then we can calculate the price of an XRP in those environments. And you want to know something mind-blowing? There are no formulas. There are no calculations. And so I was faced with a predicament. Do I sit here and just accept that there is no formula, there's no calculation, and someone else is just going to figure it out? Or do I get my bum off my seat and actually do something about it, be part of the change of this new system? I decided to go with option 2. And so I spent the last couple of weeks here diving into real models of how liquidity is treated, where the gaps are in all of that. So, what don't banks know? What do banks know? And what are they missing? And what I ended up producing was the Jackson Liquidity Framework. This is answering the question directly, how much liquidity is needed when you're in an AMM-based settlement system? I didn't just think about this, I also put it into a research paper and turned it into a white paper as well. In my next video, I'm going to be launching this white paper to the public, and this will be no doubt my largest contribution to the global financial system of my entire life. I hope not the last either. So I posted this white paper for everyone to see in the macro community, and I think people realized that this was actually real research. This is like legit research. My intention for the launch of this white paper is to have the Bank of International Settlements recognize this research, as well as the IMF and the FSB. I want them to treat this research as serious. And obviously the ideal situation at the end of the road is that the Jackson Liquidity Framework is treated as the go-to in modeling out and determining the rules for AMM-based settlement systems in global finance. And all I ask for is that you share this white paper around in your community, in your circles, online, because ultimately we want the Bank of International Settlements and the IMF to read and recognize this research. And if we can get that legitimate feedback, and that'll be the closest we've ever been, ever before, to figuring out exactly how much XRP would need to be taken out of circulation to provide liquidity to these AMM pools, because my formulas and equations would be the ones that we work on, right? Those would be the standard. And from there, we could even determine what the price of XRP potentially could be. If you're interested in XRP and you're interested in the development of this new financial system, this white paper is going to be fundamental in bringing that system to us rather than waiting for it to happen. And that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want to let someone else do it. I took control, I did it myself, I put in the hard work, and this white paper is the result of that. If you have something to say about this video, I'd love to hear it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for watching episode 13 of The Macro.